The night did not begin with mercy. It began with the kind of cold that stripped a person down to the rawest pieces of themselves. Maren Silvershade learned that truth one breath at a time, lungs biting with frost, vision swimming as she stumbled across the wilderness that stretched endlessly ahead. Snowflakes spiraled through the darkness like tiny, glittering shards, but they did not fall soft. They fell sharp, slicing across her cheeks and gathering in her lashes like frozen tears. The world around her blurred with white and shadow, as if the storm itself wanted to erase her existence. And maybe that was the point. Maybe her old pack hoped the storm would finish what they began. The imprint of their hands still marked her skin. Dark bruises hugged her wrists where the Duskvalen wolves had dragged her to the border, the same border she crossed as a child with wonder in her eyes. Tonight she crossed it with nothing but tremors in her bones. Every step felt like a punishment from the earth. Every breath tasted of exile. And yet she moved, one foot pushing forward, then the next, because stopping meant letting their last words take root inside her. The blizzard reflected those words perfectly. Everything angry, unforgiving, loud. The wind had a voice tonight, and it carried the same tone she heard in her family's final sneer, the sound of people who had already decided she was a burden. Snow whipped sideways, hurling itself against her body with the same ferocity as their rejection. She felt it all over again. The circle of wolves, their faces hard with judgment, their certainty that she was nothing but a curse waiting to explode. And maybe they weren't wrong. Somewhere beneath her skin a faint throb pulsed. Not warmth. Not comfort. Something colder than the storm and just as dangerous. A silver light flickered under her flesh, trembling like a creature begging to be released. Maren curled her fingers into fists until her nails bit deep. He would not let the glow out. Not here. Not now. Not when she could barely trust herself. The power had a mind of its own, hungry, unpredictable, tied to a prophecy she spent years trying to deny. She couldn't control it, and she knew exactly what happened the last time she lost grip. The memory surged up uninvited like a hand dragging her underwater. A forest clearing. Bright moonlight. Wolves screaming. Light bursting from her palms, wild and blinding. The ground cracking underfoot. And afterward, nothing but horror in every eye. She had been 12 when it first happened, but the shame never aged. It only grew sharper. The storm did not care about her shame. It shoved her hard as if the sky itself wanted her gone. Her boots sank deep into drifts that swallowed her ankles, forcing her to wrench herself forward again and again. She didn't know how long she'd been running, minutes, hours, maybe a lifetime, but she knew she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The crunch of steps behind her cut through the storm's roar. Not the storm's rhythm. Not her own uneven stumbling. Another set. Then another. Her heart lurched painfully as instinct tightened her muscles. The air carried their scent, familiar, bitter, unmistakable. 2 Duskvalen scouts. Wolves bred for tracking, wolves who once trained beside her, wolves who now came to finish whatever the pack elders didn't want to stain their own hands with. Their presence pressed against her spine like a blade. She didn't turn around. She didn't slow. But the sinking dread clawed at her ribs as the wind delivered the echo of their intentions, not spoken aloud in dialogue, but murmured in the narrator's voice as if carried by the storm itself. She's cursed. He's dangerous. End it before she becomes something worse. Their boots met ice with deliberation. They were gaining on her. She felt their hunger, their fear, their need to wipe out anything that didn't fit neatly into their world. She had once loved these lands, but now their coldness felt personal, as if the ground itself recoiled from her. Her legs shook. Her throat burned. Her vision wavered with dark spots that threatened to swallow everything. Yet she pushed harder, moving as though a lifeline waited somewhere beyond the wall of white. Then she saw it. Not clearly. Not fully. Only the vague outline of structure in the distance. Wood, shadow, angles half swallowed by snow and time. An old cabin. A place whispered about in childhood stories told beside crackling fires. A place no one visited anymore. A place rumored to sit dangerously close to Shadowrest Dominion's border. Some said it was abandoned. Others said wolves who entered never returned. He didn't care. Abandoned things understood her better than living ones. Her body sagged with a mix of dread and relief when her palm hit the front door. The wood was frozen, rough against her skin, but it held her weight when her knees buckled. Snow clung to her hair, her lashes, her coat, melting slowly down her neck as she slumped forward like someone whose last thread had finally snapped. The silver glow flickered again beneath her skin, weak but insistent. She pressed her forehead to the door, breath shaking, heart pounding like something trying to claw out. She wished she could stop shaking. She wished she could be someone who didn't fear herself. The footsteps behind her grew louder. The scouts were close now. Too close. Their determination seeped into the air like poison, chasing her heartbeat all the way into the dark cabin walls. She felt the world narrowing around her, storm, wolves, power, shame, everything pressing in from all sides until she didn't know if she would collapse or ignite. Her fingers slipped against the handle. Her vision blurred again. And in that fragile breaking moment, with snow dripping from her, bruises stinging and her entire world falling apart around her, the narrator's voice softens. Not the world, just the telling of it. Because sometimes a story begins in chaos, but it's the heart inside that chaos that makes someone stay to listen. And if your heart already aches for Maren, if you feel that lump in your throat, if you're already rooting for the girl who never asked for power but carries it anyway, subscribe to Anne's Romance Collections. We tell stories you feel in your bones. The storm did not pause when Maren's knees buckled at the cabin door. It roared on with merciless intent, whipping her hair around her face, dragging at the edges of her coat like a creature trying to claim what little warmth she had left. Her breath hit the frozen air in sharp bursts, thin and ragged, as if her lungs were losing the strength to keep her alive. The weight of everything pressed on her: exile, fear, shame, the faint burn of power under her skin. And beneath all that, the heavy certainty that she was seconds away from collapsing completely. But then something shifted. Not in her. Not in the storm. Behind her. The sound was quiet at first, nearly swallowed by the blizzard. Just a soft disturbance in the rhythm of falling snow, a vibration that didn't match the approach of the scouts who hunted her. This footstep was slower. Heavier. Carried with it a presence that made the air feel different, thicker, as though the world itself adjusted to accommodate it. Maren stiffened without meaning to. Her instincts, usually buried under doubt and exhaustion, flared awake like a spark finding dry kindling. She didn't turn around, couldn't force her frozen limbs to move, but a silent awareness crawled up her spine. Someone stood behind her. Someone who was not chasing her out of fear or hatred. Someone whose presence felt ancient, steady, and impossibly controlled amid the chaos of the storm. The scout's steps halted abruptly in the distance, as if they too sensed the shift. The storm swallowed their hesitation, but the tremor of uncertainty they released into the air was unmistakable. Even they, wolves trained to hunt without fear, recognized when they were outmatched by something they didn't understand. Maren's fingers slipped on the frozen cabin door as she tried to push herself upright. Her body did not obey. Her legs trembled violently, her lungs burned, and her vision blurred with dark shadows crawling at the edges. She forced herself to draw in breath after painful breath, yet each inhale felt thinner than the last. Behind her, the snow parted around a tall figure long before her senses could piece him together. The blizzard bent slightly around him as though instinctively clearing space. Ice clung to the fur lining his cloak, frost shimmered off his shoulders, and moonlight, what little pierced the storm, caught the edges of his presence like a silent crown. He didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. Every step he took carried the weight of silent authority, the kind that didn't announce itself because it never had to. Maren's heart hammered. Not out of fear. Not out of recognition. Out of something deeper. Something instinctive. Something old. The scouts whispered something she couldn't hear. Their silhouettes wavered through the snow, their confidence draining like warmth from an open wound. And then the figure came into view. He was tall enough that the storm looked small around him. Broad-shouldered beneath a heavy cloak woven from the dark pelts of ancient wolves. His hair, black as the deepest forest night, hung damp with melting snow. His jaw was rugged, defined in a way that suggested he'd learned to face the world without flinching. And his eyes, gods, his eyes, ember gold even in the blizzard's rage, glowing faintly as if lit from within. Eyes that didn't just see her. Eyes that saw through her. Maren froze, not from the cold but from the force of being noticed without being judged. There was no disgust in those eyes. No fear. No condemnation. Only awareness, sharp and quiet, the kind that took in every detail and filed it away with dangerous precision. He stepped closer and the storm thinned further around him, revealing the dark insignia etched into the clasp of his cloak. The sigil of Shadowrest Dominion. A name spoken only in warnings and whispers. A territory known for wild terrain, fierce warriors, and an alpha most packs preferred not to cross. Some said he was ruthless. Others said he was cursed. But all agreed on one thing. Ravyn Blackwell was not a man anyone wanted to meet in the wilderness. And yet here he was, walking straight toward Maren as if her collapse was the only thing in the world that required his attention. Maren tried to steady herself, tried to pull responsibility back around her bones like a shield, but her strength flickered dangerously. The The silver pulse under her skin responded to his approach, glowing faintly as if his presence was a spark awakening something she fought to keep dormant. Panic rose in her throat. If that light broke free, if it burst like it had before, she didn't know what destruction it might unleash, not on the scouts but on him. The last thing she needed was another person getting hurt because of her. She pressed her back against the cabin door, breath shuddering. Her legs threatened to give out entirely. Her pulse thrashed. And he spoke. Not with force. Not with menace. Not like someone delivering an order or a threat. But gently, with a quiet certainty that cut through the storm like a warm blade. Maren Silvershade. I've been looking for you. The words slipped into the storm with unsettling ease, as though they belonged there. As though he had been waiting for this moment. Waiting specifically for her. The sound of his voice carried something deep, something smooth, textured, and dangerously steady. A voice belonging to someone who rarely chased anything because things tended to come to him. But Maren was not things. She was a mistake wrapped in fear, wrapped in bruises, wrapped in exile. Her body responded before her mind did. A small, involuntary step back that her limbs could barely manage. Her shoulder hit the cabin wall, cold wood pressing into her spine. Her breath hitched violently. She didn't understand. She couldn't begin to process how a powerful alpha from a rival dominion knew her name. The scouts in the distance shifted anxiously, unsure whether to flee or remain frozen. Ravyn did not spare them a glance. His attention rested entirely on the trembling girl pressed against the cabin door. Not with pity. Not with predatory interest. But with something far more dangerous. Recognition. Maren's heart lurched. Her instincts screamed at her to run, even though her legs couldn't carry her another step. Another instinct, older, deeper, told her not to fear him. Told her he meant no harm. Told her something about him felt strangely familiar. But instincts lied. Hers always did. So she forced herself to distrust the warmth curling through her ribs at the sound of his voice. Ravyn stepped closer. Not enough to crowd her. Not enough to frighten her. Just close enough for her to feel the calm gravity of his presence. The quiet steadiness that contrasted the brutal chaos of the blizzard and the hunters who wanted her dead. Her knees buckled. Not from him. From everything. From the storm carving sharp cold into her bones. From the exhaustion of running until her lungs felt scraped raw. From the weight of being unwanted in a world where packs defined worth. From the silver pulse threatening to break through her skin. From the realization that someone powerful had been searching for her and she did not know why. Her vision blurred dangerously. The ground tilted. Her palms scraped the frozen wood as she tried to catch herself. But her strength vanished like snow burned away by flame. She fell. But she never hit the ground. Ravyn moved with a speed the storm couldn't follow. One moment she was collapsing, the next she was suspended in strong, steady arms that lifted her weight as though it meant nothing. His cloak brushed her cheek, cold at first, then warm where his body heat melted the frost. His scent reached her, a mix of winter pine, cold iron, and something darker, something undeniably alpha. Her head rested briefly against his shoulder. Her breath trembled. The silver glow beneath her skin flickered again, but instead of flaring wild, it steadied, confused by the unexpected safety wrapping around her. Ravyn didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The storm faded slightly as he carried her toward the cabin door she'd been too weak to open. Snow swirled gently now as if pulled back by an unseen force. The scouts retreated into the blizzard's darkness without a sound, unwilling to challenge the alpha who had claimed a presence far more significant than the territory beneath their feet. Inside the cabin, a world of shadows and forgotten memories waited, quiet, untouched, holding the weight of stories that hadn't been told in years. Ravyn carried her across the threshold with quiet purpose, closing the door on the storm, the hunters, and the life she had just narrowly escaped. And in the dim, frozen silence of the abandoned shelter, the world shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle way everything changes the moment fate finally catches up. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp frost. It was quiet, not the comforting quiet of warmth and safety, but the kind that presses into your chest, makes your ribs ache with emptiness and unspoken things. Maren's eyes fluttered open, heavy-lidded, and the fire's glow caught the frost clinging to her lashes, reflecting off the bruises still dark on her wrists. She didn't trust it at first, the warmth, the amber flicker that made shadows dance across the walls. Every nerve in her body was tense, every muscle coiled with the memory of being hunted, being abandoned, being cursed. The storm outside raged, but here inside time itself seemed to hold its breath. She drew in a shallow breath, wincing as it scraped across lungs that still ached from the run. Her gaze darted to the fire, steady, contained, and yet a tiny part of her wanted to believe in it, wanted to let herself feel something softer than cold and fear. But instinct warned her. She had been burned by trust before, by people and packs that claimed she belonged and then flung her away like trash. To relax was to risk everything. To trust even slightly was to invite betrayal. Her body tensed as she shifted slightly on the cabin's frozen floor, flinching at the memory of the scout's footsteps outside, fading but not gone. The echoes lingered in her chest like a heartbeat she could never quiet. She tried to focus on the cabin itself. The fire had been lit, probably by him. The smell of pine, ash, and something indefinably strong filled the air. Shadows clung to the corners, flickering, alive, reminding her that warmth never came without danger. Maren curled her arms around herself, the bruises on her wrists throbbing as if remembering old pain, and she realized how little she had truly rested in years. The Duskvalen pack, the nights alone, the endless expanse of snow and cold, they had all been survival, not life. And for a long time she had wondered if life would ever be hers again. Memories pressed forward, unbidden. She was 14, standing alone in a clearing, her own hands trembling as the first uncontrolled burst of her Starfire Vein erupted. Silver flames, wild and furious, shot from her fingertips. The light reflected in the eyes of her pack, eyes wide with fear, anger, disbelief. They had screamed at her, accused her, condemned her, and that night in the cold under moonlight, she had realized something terrifying. The very essence of who she was could destroy everything she loved if she wasn't careful. That night had marked the beginning of her exile, a wound deeper than bruises, deeper than frostbite. A wound that could not be seen but burned anyway. Her chest tightened as she remembered the council's words, repeated in a voice sharp and final. Your bloodline is a curse. Leave before you burn us all. The phrase was more than a command, it was a sentence, a verdict on her life, her power, her existence. She could still feel the weight of their gazes, accusing, fearful, disappointed. Every syllable echoed through her memory, intertwining with the cold, shaping her into the girl who had fled through forests and snowstorms, who had learned that being too much of herself was punishable by exile. Every breath in the cabin reminded her that the world had once decided she was dangerous, and maybe, deep down, she still wondered if they were right. The firelight flickered against her skin, teasing out the faint silver shimmer beneath it. Maren clenched her fists, feeling the pulse of her power beneath her skin, a rhythm she had always feared and fought to hide. The warmth of the cabin did little to soothe the heat that rose from inside her, the same heat that had once lit the clearing like a second moon. She closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to calm, willing the tremor to settle. She had survived storms worse than this one, endured more than she thought possible, but the presence of the Starfire Vein beneath her flesh reminded her how precarious everything still was. Power without control was death, and she had narrowly escaped it countless times. Ravyn watched. She did not look at him, did not dare, and yet she could feel his gaze, a weight not pressing but undeniable. He did not speak. He did not judge. He simply observed, silently, letting her awareness of him stretch and twist in her chest. And even without looking, Maren felt it, the recognition in him. Not of the scared, broken girl pressed to the cabin wall. Not of the hunted, exiled Omega who had stumbled into his path. He saw something deeper, something she had spent years trying to bury. The raw core of herself that had been called dangerous, cursed, unwanted. He saw the part that had survived, that had run through blizzards and storms with only fear and a faint pulse of silver guiding her. He saw destiny, and in his quiet, unyielding attention, she realized he recognized it before she did herself. Her wall of distrust rose instantly. Trust had always been lethal. Alphas, humans, packs, they had all failed her, all betrayed her, all judged her too quickly and too harshly. To relax even a fraction was to invite danger, to risk the only control she had left over her own life. She had learned the hard way that warmth could be weaponized, that kindness could be a trap, that anyone willing to offer comfort might also be the one to take everything she valued away. And yet even as her muscles tensed and her instincts screamed, she couldn't ignore it. Something about him, Ravyn Blackwell, Alpha of Shadowrest Dominion, was grounding in a way that made her breath shallow and her chest ache. It was terrifying to admit even to herself that she wanted to trust him. That a part of her longed to let the tension slide, to rest, to breathe without bracing for betrayal. The cabin itself seemed to notice the shift, the way the firelight reached out, flickering more steadily, warming the edges of the shadows. Maren's eyes followed the movement of the flame, mesmerized, because it reflected something she had never allowed herself to feel fully: hope. The idea that survival wasn't the only option, that she could exist without constantly fearing the world, without hiding her power from everyone, without running. And yet for every spark of hope, the weight of her shame pressed down harder, reminding her that nothing was free, that the Starfire Vein beneath her skin could ignite in a heartbeat and undo everything she was beginning to feel. Every inhale brought tension to her chest. Every heartbeat reminded her she was on the edge between control and chaos, between safety and devastation. Her gaze shifted slightly, catching a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. Even in the dim firelight, he was there, silent, unwavering, watching with those ember-gold eyes that seemed to know her better than she knew herself. She didn't dare look directly at him, and yet every nerve in her body felt pulled toward him. The storm outside, the blizzard, the hunters she had fled, they were distant, almost irrelevant, because here, inside this fragile cabin, a new danger existed. The vulnerability she had never allowed herself. It was terrifying and intoxicating in the same breath. Memories continued to rise unbidden. Every rejection. Every exile. Every time she had been told she was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too cursed. Each recollection wove together with the heat of the fire and the tremor of her silver pulse beneath her skin. The shame, the fear, the loneliness, they were palpable, thick in the air like smoke, almost choking her with their weight. And yet, beneath it all, something flickered faintly, quietly, like a candle refusing to die. The part of herself that had survived, that had run through snowstorms and forests alone, that had lived through fear and judgment, was still alive. And now, finally, it was being seen. Really seen. For the first time in years, the world contained someone who could look at her and understand the terror, the isolation, and the potential all at once. Her breath caught, shallow and trembling. She closed her eyes against it, against him, against the pull she could not name. Trust was dangerous, yes. But maybe, just maybe, she could allow herself a sliver. Maybe she could rest without fear, if only for a heartbeat, without letting the silver pulse ignite too violently. Her chest rose and fell, uncertain, tentative, but alive. And in that fragile, fleeting moment, the firelight seemed to warm more than just the room. It brushed the edges of her soul, reminding her that survival could evolve into something more. Something powerful. Something unbroken. The fire crackled, sending tongues of gold and orange dancing across the walls, highlighting the rough textures of old wood, the faded scratches of long-forgotten claws, and the dust that had settled in corners untouched for years. Maren's eyes flickered to it again, tracing the movements of the flames, trying desperately to anchor herself to something solid, something safe, something she could touch and believe in. Yet even in this small space she felt the walls of her own history pressing in, the invisible weight of the years she had spent alone, of the nights where frost had been her only blanket and terror her only companion. The warmth of the fire and the quiet presence of Ravyn both terrified her and tempted her, a dangerous mixture she could not name. Her mind drifted involuntarily, tugged by memories she had long tried to bury. The Duskvalen pack. The night she had been 14. The clearing where the moon had caught the first burst of her silver flame, turning her into a beacon of uncontrollable power. The pack had screamed then. Some with fear, others with anger, most with the icy distance that only those who claim to know you can wield. The ground had cracked beneath her, the silver light spilling from her veins like molten metal, and every eye upon her had twisted the moment into judgment. She had been told she was a hazard, a curse, a living weapon too dangerous to remain. And for the first time she understood the depth of what that meant. The fear had been absolute, primal, and it had not been directed at the destruction she might cause. It had been aimed at the girl she was, at the raw power that refused to conform to their expectations. She remembered their words, crisp and formal, yet dripping with venom, echoing in her chest as if they were still spoken aloud. Your bloodline is a curse. Leave before you burn us all. Even now, years later, she could hear the tone, the sharpness, the accusation, the certainty that she did not belong. The memory sent a shiver crawling down her spine, cold and electric despite the fire. That sentence had shaped everything that followed. Every flight through forests, every night spent shivering under open skies, every step she had taken into snowstorms with frost biting at her cheeks. Everything had been marked by the knowledge that the world had rejected her, and perhaps in some cruel way so had she rejected herself. Her hands, resting on her knees, flexed involuntarily. She could feel the faint pulse of silver under her skin once more, a reminder of the power that had been both her gift and her curse. The sensation was almost maddening in its persistence. Light dancing beneath flesh, a warmth that threatened to flare into fire. She clenched her fists again, teeth grinding, fighting the urge to let it out, to allow the Starfire Vein to claim its place, even if only for a moment. She did not trust herself. Not yet. Not fully. The memory of that night, of the flames erupting, of the pack recoiling in horror, remained a jagged scar that refused to fade. And then there was him. Ravyn Blackwell. His presence was a constant weight, steady and unyielding, like a mountain pressed against her shoulder. She did not dare look at him directly, not yet, but she felt him. The subtle shift in air when he moved, the quiet power in the rhythm of his breathing, the sense that he was assessing, not judging, that he was seeing more than the surface fear and exhaustion. He had not said much, only the words that had echoed through the storm. Maren Silvershade. I've been looking for you. Yet those words carried something more profound than mere recognition. They carried intent. They carried purpose. They carried the unspoken promise that she was not as alone as she had always believed. Her body remained rigid, instinctively recoiling from the possibility of trust. Alphas had never been kind to her. Power had always been weaponized against her. Warmth had been wielded like a blade. And yet, even as she stiffened, she could not ignore the pull of him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. A gravitational force that tugged at the edges of her fear, threatening to pull her into something she could not yet name. It frightened her, and yet, paradoxically, it soothed her in a way she had long forgotten. Her thoughts drifted again, this time to the exile itself. The walk to the border, the cold searing her skin, the snow that seemed to mock her every step, the emptiness of the forests that had once been home. Every tree, every shadow, every gust of wind reminded her of what she had lost, of the rejection that had carved itself into her soul. She remembered the faces, the council, the elders, her peers, eyes wide with fear, voices sharp with accusation, hearts closed with judgment. And she remembered the solitude that had followed, nights filled with silence that was both a sanctuary and a cage. She had learned to survive, yes, but surviving was not living. Survival was a slow burn that hollowed the heart while leaving the body intact. The fire flickered again, throwing shadows across the cabin, and in that light she caught the subtle details she had ignored before. The scratches on the walls told stories of previous occupants, perhaps wolves who had passed through these woods, perhaps travelers seeking refuge. Dust settled in corners untouched for decades. The cabin was abandoned, forgotten, and yet it offered her more than the world ever had. A space untouched by judgment, untouched by expectation, a place where she could simply exist. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. She was not used to space that demanded nothing of her. Space where she could breathe without consequence. Space where her power did not have to be hidden. Space where she could, for the briefest moment, simply be. Ravyn's gaze remained upon her, unwavering, a silent presence that filled the room without intrusion. She could feel it in the small shift of air when he moved, in the subtle click of boots on old wood, in the quiet way he had closed the door on the storm, on the hunters, on the chaos she had run from. There was judgment there, yes, but it was tempered with something else. Something that recognized the fractured strength within her. He did not see just a girl bruised and hunted. He saw resilience. He saw potential. He saw the raw power that she herself feared. And most terrifying of all, he seemed unafraid of it. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. The silver pulse beneath her skin thrummed with quiet insistence, a reminder of what she was, of what she could be, of what she had been forced to hide for years. She wanted to suppress it, to shrink it back down to a whisper, but the presence of this alpha, steady and unyielding, made it harder than ever. She wanted to hide, yes, but she also wanted him to see it all, to see her fully, without flinching, without judgment. That desire, quiet and dangerous, coiled in her chest, a tension that made her throat tight and her limbs tremble. Her mind wandered again, unwillingly, back to the moments before her exile. The training, the warnings, the whispered fears of those who had once been her family. She remembered the fear in their eyes when her Starfire Vein first flared, the horror as she accidentally burned the training dummy during her first uncontrolled surge, the whispered warnings that she was a danger to herself and everyone around her. Each memory carried with it a pang of shame, a reminder that being too much was a crime in their eyes. And yet, in the firelight of this cabin, under the watchful gaze of this alpha, that same shame felt different, less like a sentence and more like a challenge. Could she reclaim herself, she wondered? Could she exist without fear, without exile, without judgment? The thought was fragile, but it persisted. And then the tiniest spark of awareness hit her. He was not leaving. He had not abandoned her to the storm, to the hunters, to her own trembling body. He had carried her here into this fragile, forgotten place, and he remained watching, steady, grounded. That alone was unsettling. That alone was enough to unbalance the careful walls she had spent years constructing around herself. Trust was dangerous, yes. But the gravity of his presence suggested that some risks might be worth taking. That survival might finally evolve into something more than mere endurance. Her pulse quickened as she realized she was aware of every subtle sound. The fire crackling, the frost melting at the edges of the cabin, the distant moan of the storm outside, the faint rise and fall of his breathing. Each was a reminder that she was not alone. That she was seen. That her story, her power, her past, and her scars, all of it, mattered to someone else. And for someone who had spent years running from attention, from judgment, from love disguised as fear, that was both terrifying and intoxicating. The memory came unbidden, sharp as the edge of ice. 14 years old, trembling in the moonlight, standing alone as the pack council circled her, eyes cold, hearts closed, mouths forming words she would never forget. Their gazes bore into her chest like claws, tearing at the fragile threads of confidence she had tried to hold on to. She could feel their fear, their disgust, their conviction that she was a danger too great to be tolerated. She had tried to explain, to reason, to apologize for something she had not chosen. Her own body erupting with silver fire, a gift no child should have carried. But words failed, drowned by the thunderous judgment in the air. The council's words were not just spoken, they were carved into her soul with deliberate cruelty. Your bloodline is a curse. Leave before you burn us all. The sentence had struck her with the force of a pack-wide decree. And the exodus that followed had been both literal and symbolic. She had fled through the forests surrounding Duskvalen territory, snow underfoot and wind tearing at her hair and skin. Each step had felt like betrayal against herself, yet every glance over her shoulder reminded her she was running from more than their territory. She was running from the weight of her own potential, the dangerous fire that could ignite without warning. Her legs had burned, lungs had screamed, and her hands had bled from gripping frozen branches for balance. And yet she survived. Somehow she always survived. Now, years later, sitting in this dim cabin, she felt that same pulse of survival vibrating through her veins, tangled with fear and anticipation. The silver glow beneath her skin hummed faintly, a reminder of what had once nearly destroyed her. It was quiet, controlled by willpower alone, yet she could sense it aching to burst free, to claim space it had long been denied. The years of exile, of hiding, of running, had tempered her control, but they had also sharpened her awareness, taught her to anticipate, to measure, to brace. Survival had made her strong but not unscarred. Every inch of her carried memory and warning. Every muscle remembered the night her own power had marked her as cursed. Every heartbeat was a drum of caution and of unacknowledged longing, for belonging, for safety, for recognition. Ravyn's presence pressed against the edges of her awareness, quiet but unyielding. She could feel the way his gaze lingered not just on her body but on the space around her, the tension coiled in her muscles, the faint tremor in her hands. He saw the fear, yes, but he also saw the survival instincts, the deep intelligence, the strength that even she sometimes refused to acknowledge. And in that there was no judgment, only recognition. That alone was a revelation, one that threatened to unbalance her carefully constructed walls. She had spent her life hiding from scrutiny, from authority, from the sharp eyes of those who would never understand the Starfire Vein. And yet here, in the flickering firelight, someone was watching, waiting, and accepting her entirety. the fear, the shame, the power, and the potential. Her chest tightened with an unfamiliar sensation, one she had long denied herself. Hope. Hope tempered with caution, trembling under the weight of past betrayals. She had been exiled for being too much, for being too powerful, for being too dangerous, and yet now here she could sense the possibility of a world that would see her fully, acknowledge her strength, and allow her to exist without constant fear. The idea was fragile, almost unbearable, because it had been denied for so long that she scarcely knew how to grasp it. And yet the pull was undeniable, dangerous in its sweetness. Another memory surfaced, this one more intimate, more painful. The night spent alone in forests blanketed by snow, curled against roots and rocks, clutching the warmth she could not create herself. The cold seeped into her bones, and the only company she had were the whispers of the wind, the faint crackle of distant wildlife, and the steady, relentless reminder that she was not wanted. That her gift, her body, her very existence had been deemed too dangerous to remain. That the world had chosen to exile her rather than embrace her. Each step into adulthood had been a negotiation with solitude, with the wilderness, with the hunger for recognition she had learned to suppress. And yet, despite everything, she had survived. The firelight reflected on her skin, catching the faintest shimmer of silver that ran like a river beneath her flesh. She flexed her fingers slightly, sensing the pulse beneath her veins, the quiet rhythm of power that had once terrified an entire pack. It was a reminder that she was not merely fragile or broken. She was alive, and her survival had made her something more than she had been at 14. She was a force, though tempered, though cautious, though scarred. And the thought both exhilarated and frightened her. Ravyn remained still, a silent sentinel at the edge of the cabin. She could sense him even when her eyes refused to meet his. The subtle shift of his weight, the almost imperceptible sound of his breathing, the quiet gravity he projected, it grounded her in ways she had long ago deemed impossible. She did not trust alphas, had never trusted alphas, and yet there was a steadying effect to his presence, a reassurance that did not demand compliance or submission, only awareness and quiet acknowledgement. She could feel it threading into the fragile hope that had begun to bloom in her chest, a dangerous, thrilling sensation she dared not name. Her mind wandered again, revisiting the accident that had sparked her exile. The Starfire Vein had flared uncontrollably that night, a rush of silver light that had scorched the training grounds, marking her as an anomaly, a hazard, a living threat. The pack had recoiled, eyes wide with fear and disgust. Her own parents had spoken last, voices trembling, resigned, the final verdict uttered with cruel finality: "You cannot stay. You will destroy us all." She had fled before dawn, snow covering her tracks, the world a frozen canvas of isolation and exile. Every forest, every clearing, every ridge she had crossed carried the echo of that night, of rejection, of fear. And yet, every step had forged her into the survivor she was now. Every flight had honed her senses, sharpened her reflexes, taught her to navigate danger, and forced her to embrace the power she feared. And now, years later, sitting in the shadowed glow of this cabin, under the watchful attention of a figure she did not yet fully understand, she felt the tension in her body begin to shift. The pull between fear and trust, between shame and potential, between isolation and connection, wound tighter and tighter until she thought her chest would shatter. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. It was everything she had feared, and everything she had secretly longed for. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she realized something profound. She had survived alone for so long that she had forgotten what it was to be seen, really seen, without judgment. To be acknowledged not for her mistakes, her accidents, her uncontrolled power, but for the strength that had kept her alive, the potential that had been feared, and the woman she had become despite every obstacle. And in that recognition, in that firelit silence, she felt a stirring of trust. Not blind, not naive, but fragile, careful, and electric. The cabin's warmth was a strange, almost alien sensation. Maren's body ached from the cold she had fled, the bruises on her wrists pulsing with a dull throb that reminded her of the violence she had endured. Her mind, however, was the heaviest weight. Memories collided with the present, mixing like snow and storm clouds outside. Every past betrayal, every accusation, every fear that had once governed her life pressed against the fragile calm of the firelit room. She wanted to shrink into herself, to become nothing, invisible, untouchable. But something in her refused. Some thread of stubborn life, of survival honed sharp by years of exile, made her sit up straighter, even if trembling. She glanced again at Ravyn, though not directly. The firelight cast his face into partial shadow, revealing the sharp line of his jaw, the subtle ember-gold glimmer in his eyes that made her pulse tighten. There was power in him, undeniable and instinctual, the kind of power that did not shout but commanded. And yet that power was tempered by restraint. He did not move toward her too quickly. He did not speak words she could misread. He simply existed in the room, silent, steady, the kind of presence that both unsettled and anchored her. Her body reacted before her mind could process. The muscles coiled, the skin tingled, a low, tremulous energy running beneath her skin. She was aware of her power, faint but potent, and the realization that he saw it, recognized it, and was not afraid, sent a ripple of unease in something else she had long denied, curiosity. Maren's thoughts drifted again to the Duskvalen pack. The council, the elders, the so-called family who had once sworn allegiance to her, had rejected her entirely. Their faces, frozen in judgment and fear, haunted her. She remembered the night they had driven her from the territory, voices raised, teeth bared in metaphorical snarls. Her parents had not touched her, but their eyes had cut deeper than any wound, their disappointment heavier than chains. She had been exiled for being too much, for being dangerous, for existing as a Starfire Vein bearer, someone whose power could not be tamed. Every step since that night had been a battle against the world, against isolation, against the urge to believe the pack's verdict that she was a curse. The Starfire Vein pulsed beneath her skin now, faint and controlled, yet every heartbeat echoed with the memory of the flare that had marked her as cursed. The silver shimmer moved under her flesh, a river of energy she could not allow to escape. She flexed her fingers slightly, feeling the rhythm, the quiet insistence of a power that had been feared, that had been rejected, that had been her only constant companion. It was terrifying to feel it here, in the presence of another alpha, in the warmth of the cabin, in the absence of snowstorm and hunters. She had lived most of her life fearing exposure, fearing loss of control, fearing judgment. And yet now the risk of letting a fragment of that power show felt almost possible. Her attention returned to Ravyn. His eyes, though not demanding, were observing, patient, deliberate. There was no mockery, no fear, no judgment, only awareness. The ember-gold glow seemed to pierce through the layers of her fear, her shame, her self-doubt, and touch something at the core of her identity she had long protected, long hidden, long thought to be too dangerous for anyone to see. For the first time in years she felt the strange, vulnerable pull of being understood, truly understood, without the need for explanations or apologies. Her walls, built over years of exile and trauma, trembled in response, the mortar of distrust cracking at the edges. She shifted slightly, pulling her knees to her chest. Her breath was uneven, a mixture of caution and curiosity, fear and longing. She could feel the subtle tension coiling in her body, the old, ingrained habit of bracing for impact, of running at the first sign of danger. And yet Ravyn did not threaten her. He did not demand compliance or submission. His presence was heavy but not oppressive, grounding but not smothering. It was unfamiliar, dangerous. And the more she allowed herself to notice it, the more the tension in her chest changed from defensive to anticipatory, from fear to something sharper, something that made the blood hum in her veins. Memories of her flight from Duskvalen surfaced once more. The cold, the snow, the blizzard-like nights where the wind screamed like the voices of those who had cast her out. She remembered every step, every stumble, every bruise, every frostbite that had left its mark. She had learned to survive through sheer will, through constant vigilance, through a knowledge that the world would never forgive her for existing as she was. The forest, the snow, the cold, the wolves who had once been her pack, they were all etched into her memory as markers of exile and rejection. And yet, despite the isolation and the terror she had endured, she had run through storms, evaded hunters, and preserved her life. That survival had hardened her, yes, but it had also left raw edges, places where fear and longing intertwined in ways she did not yet fully understand. The firelight danced across the cabin walls, illuminating the subtle silver sheen of her Starfire Vein beneath the skin of her arms and neck. She flexed her fingers again, feeling the warmth of power that had been denied to her for so long. The cabin, abandoned and silent, seemed to breathe with her, the shadows stretching and contracting as though acknowledging her presence, her survival, her existence. Here she realized she was not merely an Omega hiding from the world. She was Maren Silvershade, the girl who had survived the pack, the storms, the exile, the fear. The girl who had learned to navigate the treacherous line between power and destruction. The girl who now, for the first time in years, felt a tentative spark of agency, of choice, of possibility. Ravyn's presence remained a steady, unspoken force beside her. He was not demanding, not pressing, not impatient. He simply existed, a sentinel of quiet strength, observing without intruding, acknowledging without judgment. That alone was unsettling. She had spent her life hiding from scrutiny, hiding from authority, hiding from the gaze of anyone who might misunderstand or misuse her power. And yet here, with the firelight flickering over his face, the ember-gold eyes locking onto her subconscious tremors, she felt a pull, toward him, toward trust, toward a fragile and dangerous possibility of connection. Her heartbeat quickened, a rhythm that matched the pulse of the silver beneath her skin. She was aware of every sensation, the warmth of the fire on her cheeks, the subtle sound of Ravyn's breathing, the distant howl of the storm beyond the cabin walls, the residual ache of muscles exhausted from running. Every element combined into a tapestry of intensity, a collision of past trauma, present uncertainty, and potential future possibility. She realized, with a mix of fear and awe, that she had survived everything thrown at her, but she had never survived being seen like this. And now, in this small, abandoned cabin with the weight of his gaze anchoring her, she was beginning to feel something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Something fragile, tentative, almost unbearably dangerous. Hope. Hope that the world could be different. Hope that someone could see her without fear. Hope that her existence, with all its scars and silver fire, could be acknowledged rather than rejected. Her body, still trembling from exhaustion and cold, reacted instinctively. The warmth of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the subtle presence of Ravyn, steady, unjudging, patient, created a tension she could not ignore. Her instincts, honed through years of exile and flight, screamed at her to retreat, to curl into herself and hide from this vulnerability. But another part of her, a quieter, more stubborn part, urged her forward, whispered that she could survive this too. Her chest ached in a strange mix of fear and longing. She remembered the Duskvalen Pack's scorn, the way the council's words had cut her like knives, how her parents' disappointment had branded her as a curse. The silver flame in her veins, the Starfire Vein, had been both her salvation and her condemnation. That same power now thrummed beneath her skin, faint but insistent, reminding her of her strength, her resilience, her survival. She could feel it coiling and humming, and she realized that it was not just a dangerous gift. It was a part of her identity, a part she had fought to contain for years, but a part that also made her unstoppable. Ravyn's gaze followed her subtle movements. He did not speak, but she felt the weight of his awareness, the quiet acknowledgement of her inner fire. He was not demanding, not intrusive, not judging. He simply saw her, the fear, the pain, the power, and the potential, and allowed her to exist fully in that acknowledgement. That alone unsettled her, made her heart race, made her pulse echo through her body in a rhythm that matched the silver light beneath her skin. She realized she had spent years hiding from scrutiny, from authority, from judgment, from even herself. And yet here, in the warmth of this cabin, she felt the faintest crack in the walls she had built around herself. The memories of running through snow, of frost-bitten nights, of the hunters' voices still echoed faintly in her mind, but they were fading, pushed aside by a new, fragile awareness. She was not alone. For the first time, she felt the possibility of being seen without fear, of being understood without explanation, of existing without constant rejection. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. And yet the pull was undeniable. She could feel the tension coiling in her body, a mix of defensive instinct and a strange, dangerous longing to lean into this feeling, to trust it, to trust him. Her thoughts drifted again to the night of the flare, the uncontrollable eruption of silver fire that had marked her as cursed. She had been a child then, terrified of her own power, terrified of the pack, terrified of the judgment she knew would follow. She had fled, endured snowstorms, tracked by hunters, relying on instinct and survival alone. And she had survived. Now, as she sat here in the cabin with Ravyn, she realized that survival had made her strong, but it had also left wounds that had never healed, fears that still gripped her chest, and a longing for connection she had never allowed herself to name. Her pulse quickened as she felt the subtle heat of the fire, the faint thrum of her starfire vein beneath her skin, the steady presence of Ravyn nearby. It was a dangerous combination, past trauma colliding with present possibility. She was aware of every sensation, the ache in her muscles, the bruises on her wrists, the residual tremor in her fingers, the faint silver glow beneath her skin, the weight of being seen, the pull of hope threading through her chest. And in that moment she realized something profoundly unsettling and exhilarating. She was beginning to believe that she might not be cursed, that she might not be alone, that her power, her scars, her very existence, could be a force for something greater than fear and exile. Maren's breath came in shallow, uneven bursts as she allowed herself to sit in that feeling, to acknowledge the vulnerability and the power within her. She could feel the quiet tension between fear and trust, between shame and hope, between isolation and connection. The cabin, once a simple shelter, had become a crucible for her emotions, a place where the past and the present collided, forcing her to confront everything she had hidden for so long. Her eyes flicked to Ravyn, and for the first time she allowed herself to wonder, not with fear but with tentative curiosity, what it would mean to trust him, to let someone see her fully, to exist without hiding. The ember gold glow in his eyes did not waver. It held her attention, steady, grounding, almost like an anchor in the storm of her emotions. And in that gaze she felt the stirrings of a possibility she had long denied. A connection that was not built on fear, not built on judgment, but on recognition, respect, and perhaps even something deeper. The starfire vein pulsed faintly, in sync with her rising awareness. It was a reminder that she was alive, that she was powerful, that she had survived the storms of her past, and that she could survive this new fragile opening into trust and hope. She felt the tension between past and present, between fear and desire, between exile and belonging, tighten and then release, leaving her both exhausted and exhilarated. She realized with a quiet, trembling certainty that she was no longer just the broken Omega fleeing from the world. She was Maren Silvershade, the girl who had endured, who had survived, who had mastered herself enough to sit here and feel hope stirring for the first time in years. And in the emberlit silence of the cabin, with the storm raging outside and the quiet power of her starfire vein beneath her skin, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel, to exist, to be seen. She was still wary. She was still scarred. She was still vulnerable. But she was also beginning to understand something she had never allowed herself to believe. That survival had forged her into someone capable of more than running, someone capable of connection, someone capable of being seen without fear. And as the quiet warmth of the cabin wrapped around her, she felt the faintest thrill of anticipation, the subtle stirring of trust, and the dangerous, intoxicating possibility of a future she had once thought impossible. The morning after the storm left the cabin, the snow outside had quieted into a crystalline hush, blanketing Shadowrest's dominion in a soft, ghostly light. Maren stirred beneath the thin blanket Ravyn had draped around her shoulders, her body still aching from exhaustion, her mind still tangled in the webs of memory and fear. The silver pulse beneath her skin, her starfire vein, throbbed faintly like a whisper she could barely hear, yet impossible to ignore. And then, almost without warning, Ravyn spoke, his voice low, steady, and unflinching, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "You bear it," he said, the ember gold gleam in his eyes settling on her like a tether. "The starfire vein. You know what that means, don't you?" Maren's throat tightened and she recoiled slightly, the words striking her like lightning. No one had ever named it aloud, had ever acknowledged it with that clarity. She shook her head, lips trembling. I don't," she whispered, voice breaking, though she had known it in the marrow of her bones. She had always felt it. A power too great, too wild, too dangerous, but she had never heard anyone call it by its true name. Ravyn's gaze softened, though it did not lose its intensity. "It is rare," he continued, "and feared. The pack called you cursed because they did not understand it. But I understand, Maren. I've seen its potential." He leaned closer, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. "You are tied to something far older than any pack, older than the borders of Shadowrest itself. You are not merely a survivor. You are part of a lineage meant for more." Maren's chest tightened. "I'm nothing," she said, almost a plea. "Just a broken Omega. Wanted. Dangerous." Her words were bitter but honest, a shield forged over years of exile and pain. The truth of her own perceived uselessness had been drilled into her for as long as she could remember. Every moment of her life had reinforced it, yet his words dared to contradict it. Ravyn did not retreat from her despair. He simply watched her, steady, patient, as if he could bear the weight of her doubt without breaking. "You are not nothing," he said quietly, almost reverently. "You are the heir of the Luminera Wolf, the one who can unite fire and shadow. The Starfire Vein is only the beginning, a mark of the power you carry within. You cannot see it yet, not fully, but you will." Maren's head sank into her hands, elbows pressed to her knees. "I can't. No. I'm not ready for this." Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. The very idea that her life, her power, her existence, was tied to something so vast, so unimaginable, made her feel smaller than she had ever felt in the blizzard, smaller than she had felt when exiled, smaller than she had felt with hunters on her heels. And yet, the tiniest spark of curiosity ignited deep within her chest. Ravyn extended a hand, long, strong, unwavering. "You don't have to believe me yet," he said. "But you must see it for yourself. Come with me. Come to Evershade Hollow." The name alone sounded like a promise or a warning. Something old, something sacred, something steeped in light and shadow. Maren hesitated, the weight of fear pressing against the tentative thrill of curiosity. Every instinct screamed to stay hidden, to remain in the safety of the cabin where her failures and exile had been contained, where her power could not erupt into the open. But there was also the pull, the almost magnetic attraction of knowing there was more, that she was more. That perhaps for the first time she might glimpse what her life could truly be. When she finally stood, swaying slightly on tired legs, Ravyn was patient, silent. His presence was steady, grounding her through every tremor of doubt and fear. They stepped out into the snow, leaving the cabin behind. Each crunch of frost underfoot, each icy gust that wrapped around them like a warning, carried the weight of the journey they were about to undertake. The path to Evershade Hollow wound through forest she had never dared enter, trees old as time itself, their branches glowing faintly in the lunar light. The glow was subtle, ethereal, a pale blue-white that made the snow shimmer as though dusted with starlight. It was beautiful, almost sacred, and it felt alive. As they walked, Maren's mind struggled to reconcile the quiet of the grove with the chaos she carried inside. She remembered her Starfire Vein, remembered the flare that had almost destroyed everything, remembered the hunters and the exile, remembered the cold and the rejection. Every step forward was a negotiation between fear and hope, between distrust and curiosity. Every step brought her closer to something she did not yet understand, but could already feel stirring in the depths of her being. Finally, they arrived at the center of the grove, where ancient stones marked a circle, runes carved deep into their surfaces. The air thrummed with energy, faint whispers brushing the edges of her consciousness. She stepped closer, drawn despite herself, and placed a hand lightly on one of the stones. The instant her fingers brushed the runes, a cascade of visions swept through her mind, fleeting images of silver fire, shadowed forests, glowing eyes, and a figure of a massive wolf, radiant and terrifying, weaving through light and darkness. A voice, soft and ethereal, seemed to echo inside her head. "Heir of the Starfire Vein, you carry the legacy. You are the bridge." The words made her chest tighten, made her knees threaten to buckle, made her entire existence tremble. She pulled back, heart hammering, tears threatening to spill. "I'm not that," she whispered aloud, voice shaking. "I'm not special. I'm just me. Just an Omega who was cast out." Ravyn stepped closer, placing a hand lightly at her back, not pushing, not demanding, simply guiding her presence. "No," he said, his voice low and unwavering. "I see you, Maren. I see the strength you've carried through every storm, every exile, every rejection. You are tied to the Luminera Wolf because you are meant to be more than survival. You are meant to unite, to wield your power with purpose, to bring fire and shadow together in a way this world has not seen in centuries. You're not nothing. You are a queen even if you cannot yet see it." Maren shook her head, tears slipping freely now. The silver shimmer beneath her skin pulsed stronger, responding to her fear, her awe, her grief, and her tentative hope. The realization that her life, her existence, carried a purpose so vast it dwarfed even the exile, the pain, the storm she had survived, threatened to unbalance her completely. And yet for the first time in her life she felt it. A dangerous, exhilarating, terrifying pull toward possibility. Toward destiny. Toward being seen for all that she truly was. Her gaze met his, and for the first time she did not look away. The ember gold of his eyes seemed to pierce through the layers of doubt and fear, seeing her entirely. The scars, the power, the exile, and the potential. And she felt it, faint but undeniable, a stirring of trust, a spark of courage, a whisper of hope. Perhaps she was more than just an unwanted Omega. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was exactly what the world had been waiting for. The tranquility of Evershade Hollow, with its glowing lunar trees and whispering runes, shattered in an instant. The soft luminescence that had seemed to cradle Maren in fragile hope now became a ghostly illumination of danger. From the edge of the grove, a low rumble rose, a sound that was neither animal nor wind, but something darker, deliberate, predatory. Maren's heart stuttered as movement flickered among the trees. Shadows, dark and jagged, raced toward them, breaking the delicate silence like a knife through silk. The Grimhowl Legion. She recognized them from the whispers of old legends. The ruthless enforcers of pack law, warriors whose very presence had once made alphas tremble. Their armor was dark, adorned with cruel spikes and bone talismans, faces hidden beneath hoods that swallowed their identities, leaving only intent glinting from behind narrow slits. Their approach was brutal, deliberate. Maren's stomach twisted into knots. The warmth of the cabin, the soft trust she had begun to feel, evaporated into icy dread. Ravyn's voice cut through the panic, calm yet laced with an edge that made the hair on Maren's arms stand on end. "Stay behind me," he said, a command and a warning rolled into one. His amber gold eyes glimmered with tension, assessing the incoming threat. Maren's body stiffened. She wanted to obey, wanted to trust, but fear gripped her, curling in her chest, clawing at her lungs. Every instinct screamed that this confrontation was bigger than anything she had faced before. The first warriors crashed through the foliage, weapons swinging. Maren froze, her hands trembling, her mind blank for the fraction of a second that felt like eternity. She could see the silver shimmer under her skin, her starfire vein thrumming like a warning, but she could not let it erupt. Not yet. Not with these unknown predators. She had survived snowstorms, hunters, exile, and the cruelty of her own pack. But this was different. This was immediate. This was life or death, and she felt the weight of her inadequacy press down on her like a physical force. Ravyn moved. In a heartbeat, his form blurred, shifting, contorting, and emerging as a massive shadow-furred wolf, dark as midnight, with eyes that burned like molten gold. His sheer size, his presence, radiated authority and menace. Maren's breath caught in her throat, half in awe, half in terror. She had never seen a shifter move with such fluid, raw power. The air itself seemed to hum with the energy he radiated, vibrating against her chest, and a tremor ran through her body as she realized how exposed she felt beside him. The Grimhowl warriors faltered, not in fear of her, but of him. Yet their voices rose, shrill and accusing, slicing through the charged air. "She carries the Starfire curse. End her. The flame will destroy us all." Maren's stomach lurched. Her own power, the thing she had fought to hide, was now the focal point of this violence. The silver fire beneath her skin pulsed, trembling like a caged storm, and she could feel the pull to release it, to defend, to fight. But the thought of harming Ravyn, the only person who had seen her as more than danger, froze her utterly. The lodge was quiet except for the low crackle of the hearth, the warm amber glow painting shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind whipped against the eaves, carrying with it the icy bite of the Shadowrest Dominion night. Maren sat on the edge of a worn wooden chair, the soft wool of her cloak still dusted with frost, fingers brushing nervously against the edge of her skirt. Her mind still raced from the confrontation in Evershade Hollow, the voices of the Grimhowl Legion echoing in her ears, the terrifying weight of the Starfire Vein thrumming beneath her skin. The door creaked and she tensed. Ravyn entered, his shadow stretching long across the floor, his usual commanding presence softened by a grimace that betrayed pain. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, one hand pressed against a gash across his shoulder, crimson seeping through the fabric of his coat. Even in his injured state, there was power in his every motion, a quiet force that demanded attention. Maren's pulse quickened, a mix of fear and concern pulling her forward instinctively. I can help, she whispered, voice barely audible over the hearth's crackle. Her hands shook slightly as she approached him. Every instinct screamed caution, every memory of rejection and exile made her hesitate. And yet, a pull she did not fully understand, a tether forged from the storm of their shared survival, drew her closer. Ravyn's eyes met hers, warm with something she could not name, an unspoken invitation and trust. Do what you must, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain. The weight of his words settled on her like a challenge and a comfort at once. She knelt, fingers brushing his arm as she examined the wound. The contact, light as it was, sent sparks through her chest, a subtle, almost dangerous electricity that made her fingers tremble. Maren's breath hitched, awareness of him consuming her attention, the quiet intimacy of this moment wrapping around them like a fragile, luminous thread. Carefully she tended to the wound, cleaning it and pressing bandages into place. Their hands brushed again, longer this time, and she felt her heart skip a beat. Her pulse thumped audibly, and she caught herself imagining what it would feel like to lean closer, to close the distance that hung charged between them. The firelight danced in his eyes, reflecting a depth of pain and resilience she recognized as kindred to her own. I've lost more than I can count, Ravyn said suddenly, breaking the silence, his voice low and rough with unspoken scars. Betrayal, family, a prophecy I was meant to fulfill, and yet it feels like every path I've walked has led me here, to chaos, to storms, to... He paused, and the weight of his gaze held hers, heavy and intense. To you. Maren froze. Her hands stilled, the cloth slipping slightly from her fingers. She felt her chest tighten, the Starfire Vein pulsing faintly in response, reacting to the raw honesty in his words, the vulnerability he allowed himself to share. It was disorienting and grounding at the same time, a collision of fear and something more. She started, her voice breaking, I'm afraid of it. Of my fire. Of what I could do if I lost control. Of hurting you. Her words spilled into the quiet room, laden with years of self-recrimination and hidden terror. The truth was heavy, a confession she had never dared to voice. And yet here in the glow of the hearth, with Ravyn wounded yet unwavering, it felt possible, necessary even, to say it aloud. Ravyn's hand reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, fingers grazing her cheek in the gentlest of motions. His voice, barely above a whisper, held authority without pressure, warmth without judgment. Your power is not a curse, Maren. It's a calling. It's a part of you, yes, but it is meant for something greater, something beyond fear and exile. I've seen it, and I know what it can do when guided, when embraced. Her lips parted slightly, a shiver running through her as his words sank in, mingling with the lingering tension of their physical closeness. The firelight flickered across his face, softening the sharp lines, the ruggedness, leaving only the intensity of someone who had endured, who had suffered, and who had chosen to stand there, open with her. The moment stretched, charged and fragile, like a snowflake poised before it falls. They leaned toward each other almost instinctively, drawn by a force neither had yet named. The warmth of his body, the quiet power radiating from him, the closeness of their faces, it made her chest ache with desire and terror at once. She could feel the pull of possibility, the temptation of trust, and the nearly unbearable intensity of being seen fully by someone other than herself. And then she pulled back. Just enough to break the nearness, to shield herself from the overwhelming tide of vulnerability and longing. Her pulse raced, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed them against her thighs. I can't, she whispered, almost inaudible. The ache in her chest was sharp, bittersweet, a longing unfulfilled yet necessary for survival. Her instincts screamed to run, to hide, to protect the fragile shards of herself she had only just begun to uncover. Ravyn's gaze softened but did not waver. He did not push, did not speak further, simply allowed the tension to hang, acknowledging her choice while leaving the door open. There was power in his restraint, in the silent promise that he would wait, that he would see her fully and not force her before she was ready. Maren's heart pounded, a symphony of fear, desire and wonder. The Starfire Vein pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, in harmony with the unspoken connection between them. She felt the weight of her past, the exile, the fear, the near-death moments, the grim Howl Legion's accusations, all of it mingling with the fragile hope that she could allow herself to feel, to trust, to lean into possibility. She exhaled slowly, leaning back, grounding herself in the reality of the lodge, the fire, the wounded alpha before her. There was no judgment in his eyes, only acknowledgement, and that alone made her tremble with a quiet, fierce longing. The almost kiss, the near moment of surrender, lingered like a pulse in the room, a promise unspoken, a tether forged in mutual vulnerability, danger, and need. And for the first time in a long time, Maren allowed herself to imagine what it would mean to trust, to belong, to exist fully, even with all the shadows and fire that defined her. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, with prophecy, with her own doubts. But in that fleeting electric moment she felt something she had thought lost forever. The possibility of connection, the spark of hope, and the stirring of a love she had barely dared to name. The great hall of Shadowrest Dominion loomed above her, massive stone walls etched with centuries of history, every carving whispering stories of loyalty, power, and authority. Maren's steps echoed as she entered, her boots crunching softly on frost-streaked marble. The air was heavy with expectation, a suffocating blend of reverence and dread. Every eye in the council chamber turned toward her the moment she crossed the threshold, 100 pairs of eyes weighing her like accusations she could not escape. She tried to steady herself, to keep the fire beneath her skin contained, to remain composed, but the memory of Evershade Hollow, the Grim Howl Legion, and the fragile connection she had begun to forge with Ravyn pressed against her heart like ice and flame entwined. She knew this gathering would not be ordinary. The tension in the room hummed, vibrating through the air like a storm waiting to break. Ravyn stood near the high dais, his posture taut, his gaze fixed ahead, yet something in the set of his shoulders and the tension in his jaw hinted at unease. He had not warned her what to expect. He had only said, "Stay strong. Show them who you are." But strength felt like a hollow shield tonight, fragile against the weight of suspicion and centuries of fear. Then Starfire stepped forward. Ravyn's trusted advisor, a wolf whose loyalty to the Dominion had always been unwavering, but whose ambitions had always lingered beneath the surface like a coiled shadow. Her golden eyes glinted with something darker tonight, a premeditated triumph that made Maren's blood run cold. "People of Shadowrest," Saris began, voice calm, cold, and deliberate, "we have been deceived. For years, we've allowed a dangerous element to walk among us, hidden in plain sight." The room murmured, unease rippling like wind across a frozen lake. Maren's pulse accelerated, every nerve screaming in anticipation, yet confusion tangled with dread. Then Saris fixed her with a gaze that felt like ice-piercing flesh. "This Omega Maren Silvershade is not merely rare. It is catastrophic. The Starfire Vein she bears is not a blessing. It is a curse. Prophecy declares that she will not unite the clans. She will burn them." Maren froze. The words struck her like shards of glass. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to demand the truth, but the chamber seemed to constrict, every wall pressing in. She saw Ravyn shift subtly, the flicker of hesitation in his amber gold eyes, a microsecond of silence that stretched into eternity. And in that silence her heart shattered. He had not spoken up. He had not stopped Saris. The betrayal was sharp, slicing through her chest like a knife made of ice and fire. She felt the old familiar sting of exile, rejection, and abandonment tighten around her like a vice. Every shred of hope, every fragile spark of trust she had allowed herself to kindle in Ravyn's presence threatened to die under the weight of this public denouncement. Her knees buckled. She felt the frost bite through the soles of her boots, the cold stone beneath her slipping into her bones, but it did nothing to numb the anguish clawing from the inside. She wanted to run, to vanish, to escape into the frozen night where no one could touch her, where no one could see her weakness. And so she did. She fled, heedless of the whispered commands and startled shouts behind her. The doors of the Dominion burst open into the icy expanse of night. Snow swirled around her like ghostly fingers, the moonlight catching on her tears and the silver pulse of her Starfire Vein. She ran blindly, limbs trembling, lungs burning, heart screaming in betrayal and heartbreak. Her emotions, a tempest of grief, rage, and fear, blended with her power in ways she had never allowed. And then it happened. A sudden surge of energy erupted from her chest, from the very core of her being. The silver flame that had always been restrained, trembling beneath the surface, could no longer be contained. It shot outward in a blinding burst, illuminating the frozen landscape like a storm of molten light. Snow and ice fractured beneath her feet, trees shivering under the raw force, the wind howling as if the world itself recognized the awakening of something ancient and unstoppable. Maren stumbled, exhausted, trembling from the exertion and the emotional toll, yet a strange exhilaration coursed through her veins. She had been powerless for so long, exiled, rejected, mocked, hunted, and yet now, in this moment of betrayal and fury, she was impossible to ignore. Her Starfire Vein had answered her despair with force, with brilliance, with a reminder that she was not meant to be invisible, not meant to be weak, and certainly not meant to be controlled. From the shadows of the trees she sensed movement, watchers, perhaps drawn by the display of her power, perhaps sensing the same awe and fear that she herself felt. And in that moment Maren made a vow to herself, a silent promise louder than any counsel, louder than Cerys's accusations, louder than the cold that wrapped around her like a shroud. She would never be helpless again. Her eyes, glowing faintly silver in the moonlight, lifted toward the distant silhouette of Shadowrest's dominion, toward the hall where betrayal had been sown. And she knew deep in the marrow of her bones that this night was only the beginning. The world would not forgive her, would not understand her, would try to break her. But she would not, could not, be broken again. Not by anyone. Ravyn's voice carried faintly in the distance, though she did not turn. He called her name, his tone a mixture of authority, anguish, and something else she could not yet name, but she did not stop. Not now. Not until she had claimed the fire inside her as her own. The snowstorm whipped harder, swirling around her, yet she no longer felt cold. The Starfire Vein, once a source of fear and shame, now pulsed with strength, with defiance, with life. The frozen ground cracked and glittered under her feet, a testament to the power she could no longer deny, a herald of the force she would one day wield to shape destiny, to challenge the betrayals of the past, and to confront those who dared to call her curse instead of calling her what she truly was, unstoppable. The first time Maren set foot on the frozen plateau outside Shadowrest's dominion since her flight, the wind hit her like a living thing, an icy beast that clawed at her cheeks, whipped her hair into a wild halo and stole the warmth from her bones. The night sky stretched endless above, stars pale against the silver glow emanating from her own veins. She could feel it pulsing, throbbing like a heartbeat all its own, and this time she did not hide it. This time she would let it answer the chaos around her. The ritual site sprawled before her, a field of frozen monoliths etched with runes long forgotten. Fires, small and flickering, had been ignited in deliberate patterns, casting menacing shadows that danced across the ice. Wolves of the Dominion huddled, their eyes wide with terror and confusion, noses lifted to the wind, senses alert to every ripple of danger. And in the midst of it, Ravyn, her alpha, stood defiant, but he was surrounded, outnumbered, and wounded from his attempt to protect them. His golden eyes met hers across the expanse, a silent plea tangled with fierce warning: do not hold back. The enemy, led by the shadowed form of Cerys Varen, who had betrayed her at the council, moved with precision and malice. Every step they took was calculated to dominate, to intimidate, to control. Weapons glinted in the dim light, arrows nocked, blades raised, chants rising in a crescendo meant to bind her and extinguish the Starfire Vein once and for all. Maren's chest tightened. Rage, grief, and determination fused inside her like lightning in a storm. She had been hunted, shamed, and rejected, but she was no longer the girl who trembled in exile. She inhaled sharply, the cold biting her lungs, and let the fire beneath her rise. Her hands lifted instinctively, fingers trembling at first, then steadying as silver light began to crawl along her skin, tracing the veins of her arms, illuminating her from within. The Starfire Vein answered her call, pulsing with the memory of every betrayal, every lonely night, every whispered insult that had called her cursed. She embraced it now, not as a danger but as a weapon, a shield, a declaration. The world around her shivered in response. Snow lifted from the ground in swirling eddies, ice cracking with tiny fractures that spread like lightning along the frozen soil. Wolves scattered, instinctively aware that something monumental had awakened. Ravyn's gaze never left her. He stepped forward despite the arrows aimed at him, pain etched across his features, but he trusted her, and that trust burned inside her heart, fanning the fire further. Maren took a step forward. Then another. Each movement was measured, deliberate, a rhythm of power and intent. She raised her voice, and though it was a whisper, the very air around her carried it as if the mountains themselves listened. I am not your sacrifice. I am not your weapon. I am me. The light burst from her in waves, each pulse more potent than the last. Ancient runes etched into the monoliths flared with recognition, trembling in their foundations, glowing with a blue-white intensity that mirrored her silver flame. The ground itself responded, small tremors rippling outward, cracking frozen stone, lifting shards like glass into the air. Every wolf, every bystander felt the energy radiating from her. She was no longer fragile, no longer exiled, no longer something to be controlled. He was the storm itself. Ceres stepped forward, hand outstretched, trying to manipulate, to dominate. You cannot contain it, Maren. You will destroy us all. Her voice carried authority, venom, and fear, an attempt to bind power with words. But Maren shook her head, silver flames licking higher along her limbs, consuming the night air with brilliance. You do not understand, she said, voice rising, strong and resonant, filled with authority she had never allowed herself before. I am not yours to command. I am not yours to fear. I am not yours at all. Then came the transformation. Her limbs elongated, muscles coiled and strengthened beneath the silver light, fur erupting in a cascade of luminous white streaked with silver fire. Her eyes glowed like molten moons, her voice echoed with a resonance that carried through the trees, through the ice, through the very air itself. The voice of ancestors, of the long line of silver flame Omega and Alphas who had been erased from history, joined with hers. It was a chorus and a roar, and it shook the hearts of friend and foe alike. The enemy faltered, staggered by the raw magnitude of what stood before them. Ravyn's shadow-furred form shifted beside her, massive and protective, yet even he stepped back slightly, aware of the scale of her awakening. This was no longer a girl hunted, no longer an Omega hiding in fear. This was power incarnate, a force of nature bound in human form, unyielding and breathtaking in its intensity. The ground cracked beneath her feet, ice shattering in fractal patterns, light bursting from the fissures, illuminating the night sky with a glow that painted the snow in hues of silver and blue. Trees shuddered, some bowing as if acknowledging her dominion. The runes pulsed in synchrony, ancient magic recognizing the one they had long awaited. Every instinct, every cell of her being, screamed that she was finally whole, finally free, finally claiming the legacy that had been denied to her. Ceres's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as she realized the extent of her miscalculation. All the manipulation, all the council's power, all their warnings and threats, they could not contain this. Not now. Not ever. The prophecy had been twisted by fear, by ambition, by misunderstanding, but Maren had reclaimed it. The Silverfire Vein within her flared brighter, spilling outward in arcs of shimmering light, forming a shield around the ritual site and every wolf she had sworn to protect. Ravyn's eyes met hers again, no words needed. The trust, the connection, the bond they had begun to forge, now fortified by shared survival and the unshakable revelation of her power, anchored her heart even as the storm raged around them. A single pulse of silver fire erupted from her chest, sweeping through the ice and snow, carving intricate fractals that glimmered like frozen lightning. Every shard of ice, every tree, every rune trembled and resonated, as if the world itself acknowledged the rebirth of something long dormant and extraordinary. She roared, not in anger, not in fear, but in triumph, raw, unbridled, alive. And then, as the echoes of her power faded into the night, she saw it. The shadow lurking just beyond the edge of the clearing, larger, more dangerous, more cunning than Ceres had ever been. The real villain, the force that had been orchestrating chaos from the shadows, revealed itself. Maren's eyes narrowed, silver flame flickering in anticipation, and she knew with absolute certainty that the battle had only just begun. Yet for the first time she did not tremble. She did not run. She was not helpless. She was Maren Silvershade, heir of the Starfire Vein, the storm incarnate, the flame of legacy, and she would face this new threat with every ounce of power, every shred of courage, every heartbeat she had reclaimed from exile and betrayal. The snow swirled around her like loyal spirits, the moonlight catching her luminous form as she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and prepared for the confrontation that would define her destiny. The night itself seemed to hold its breath. I am not your sacrifice, she whispered to the darkness, voice echoing like a prophecy. I am the reckoning. And in that moment the world, frozen and silent, understood. Maren Silvershade had claimed her power, and nothing, not counsel, not betrayal, not fear, would ever take it from her again. Maren stood at the edge of Solmere Crest, the wind whipping through her silver and white hair, tugging at her cloak, scattering it like liquid moonlight around her. The world beneath her sprawled endlessly, frozen forests stretching like veins, jagged peaks reaching into the star-flecked sky, and rivers of ice that glimmered in the faint glow of her Starfire Vein. Every inhale filled her lungs with the chill of winter, every exhale mingled with the shimmering heat of her power, and every heartbeat echoed with the weight of what had come before and what was yet to come. Ravyn stood beside her, solid and unflinching, his amber-gold eyes fixed on her with a mixture of awe, concern, and something deeper, something she could not yet name. Behind them, the Shadowrest wolves formed a living wall of silent devotion, their forms outlined against the moonlight, eyes reflecting both loyalty and fear, tension coiled in every sinew. They waited, uncertain, sensing that this moment, this pause, was not merely a lull but the quiet before an inevitable storm. Maren's hands clenched at her sides, her Starfire Vein pulsing, flickering, like a heartbeat made visible. She could feel the magnitude of her power, the sheer responsibility pressing against her chest. It was intoxicating, terrifying, liberating. She had claimed her fire, embraced it, wielded it, but the world had not forgiven her yet. Could they ever see her not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as the force that could save them all? Ravyn's voice cut through the wind, low, steady, almost intimate despite the chaos that threatened beyond the crest. Maren, whatever comes next, we face it together. His words carried weight, promise, and a subtle warning, the kind that only someone who had seen betrayal could give. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust him, but the memory of Cerys's betrayal, the council's whispers, the exiles and hunts of her past pressed against her like ice and shadow. Could she rely on anyone? Could she rely even on him? Her gaze swept across the horizon. The enemies they had faced were only the beginning. Somewhere beyond the moonlit ridges, forces stirred, shadowy, relentless, and patient. They would not wait for hesitation. They would not forgive weakness. Maren felt it in her bones, in the pulse of her silver flame, in the tremor of the wind around her. The world demanded a choice, and she had to decide what kind of fire she would become. And yet, even in the midst of that certainty, doubt gnawed at her. Was she the savior whispered of in the prophecies? Or was she the spark that would ignite the end of everything she had begun to protect? Every scar, every betrayal, every ounce of power she had reclaimed pressed against her like a question written in flame. Who were you meant to be, Maren Silvershade? Ravyn stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the snow, the heat of his presence brushing against the chill that clung to her skin. He didn't force her to answer. He didn't speak judgment or demand obedience. He simply stood, unwavering, a reminder that even amid uncertainty she was not alone. And for a heartbeat, Maren almost let herself hope. Almost let herself believe that they could face what was coming, together. But the night was patient and the mountain silent, and in that stillness, the narrator's voice echoed through the wind, haunting, lyrical, resonant. Is she a savior, or the spark of an ending? Can a heart forged in exile, betrayed by blood, and tempered in fire rise above destiny, or will the world fall before her brilliance? Maren's silver fire flared again, bright and defiant, a living pulse that danced across her veins and illuminated the snow in every direction. It was more than power. It was a declaration, a question, a challenge to all who would doubt her, to all who would fear what she could become. And in that brilliance, every watcher, every wolf, every hidden enemy felt the weight of choice pressing against them, because the question was no longer hers alone. Ravyn's amber gaze met hers, steady, unwavering, almost pleading yet silent. He would follow her into the storm, but would she allow herself to be followed? Could she trust him to stand by her when the world demanded a reckoning? The wind howled, carrying her words though she spoke none aloud, and the snow sparkled like shards of silver glass beneath the eerie light of the moon. In the silence, in the space between heartbeats, the narrator's voice rose again, soft but searing, carrying the intimacy of a secret shared between friends, lovers, and conspirators of fate. If Maren's fire awakens something in you, If her courage, her heartbreak, her defiance set something alight in your own soul, subscribe to Anne's Romance Collections. Here, stories burn bright and hearts remember what it means to fight, to feel, to rise. Choose her side. Or step aside. The fire waits for no one. And for a moment, standing atop Solmere Crest, with the moon painting her silhouette in silver and shadow, with Ravyn beside her, and the weight of destiny pressing from every direction, Maren felt it. The quiet thrill, the electric tremor of what was coming. The cliffhanger of all her life, the cusp of every story, the precipice before transformation. She did not step back. He did not hesitate. She inhaled, letting the cold fill her lungs, and felt the fire within her roar in acknowledgement. The world had asked her to choose. And Maren would choose. The moon hung low and heavy above Solmere Crest, its silver glow reflecting off the frozen expanse like liquid light. Maren's form, outlined by the pulsing brilliance of her Starfire Vein, radiated power and defiance. But the air around her trembled with something older, something unseen. The snow beneath her boots shivered as if alive, tiny fissures opening across the frozen ridge, whispering that the world itself was acknowledging her awakening. Ravyn stood just behind her, shadowed by the night, yet every muscle coiled, every instinct alert. He had faced countless threats, endured betrayals, seen enemies fall and allies turn, but even he could feel the pulse of anticipation that thrummed in the air, like a drumbeat that belonged not to him, nor to any wolf he had known, but to a force both ancient and immeasurable. Maren felt it first, a subtle vibration beneath the surface of her Starfire Vein, an echo of power that did not belong to her, yet resonated with her very essence. She turned, eyes narrowing against the wind that whipped ice and snow across her face. The silence was not empty. It was waiting, watching. The mountains, the trees, even the snow, everything seemed poised on a precipice, ready to respond to something that had slumbered far too long. And then the ground trembled. It started small, almost imperceptible, a shiver beneath her boots, the faint rumble that made even the shadowrest wolves lift their heads and growl low, warning their senses that something monumental had stirred. But the tremor intensified, spreading outward in irregular pulses, shaking loose shards of ice, rattling ancient monoliths, and making the very air vibrate with tension. Maren's pulse raced in perfect synchrony with the trembling ground, the rhythm of anticipation and fear, exhilaration and uncertainty, coursing through her like a living thing. From the abyss below, a voice whispered, not spoken aloud, but carried in the resonance of the snow, the wind, the fractures in the frozen earth. It was soft, ethereal, yet unmistakable, curling around her thoughts, brushing against her mind like fingers of smoke. She is not the only Luminera. Maren's eyes widened, the words embedding themselves into her consciousness, carrying both warning and revelation. The weight of it pressed against her chest, making her heart skip, making her knees buckle for a fraction of a heartbeat before her Starfire Vein flared in defiance, illuminating the ridge in shimmering silver brilliance. She had thought she understood her destiny, that the prophecy, the visions, the whispers had been singular, meant only for her. But now, the universe was teasing something far larger, far more complex and far more dangerous. Ravyn's hand brushed her shoulder, grounding, steadying, but even his amber gold eyes reflected awe and apprehension. He knew she had heard it. He knew the words carried more weight than any sword or shield could bear. Yet he did not speak. He did not try to explain. He simply stood beside her, sharing her vantage point, sharing her awareness, the tension binding them tighter than any words could. The wind shifted, whipping snow into tiny spirals that caught the light of her flames, glittering like shards of glass in the moonlight. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the mountainside, dark forms moving at the edges of perception, too quick, too deliberate to be mere animals or wind-blown debris. Maren's heartbeat accelerated, but not with fear alone. There was recognition in the tremor of the ground, a pull that resonated with her own power. Something ancient, hidden, waiting for the moment she awakened had sensed her, and it was responding. She clenched her fists, silver fire dancing along her veins like a living pulse. Every instinct screamed caution. Every heartbeat demanded vigilance. Yet beneath it, deep in the marrow of her bones, a spark of excitement thrummed. She had faced exile, betrayal, war, and self-doubt, and she had risen. Now, the horizon hinted at a challenge greater than any before, and the fire within her roared in anticipation. Ravyn leaned closer, his presence a solid anchor amid the trembling world, but even his voice when he finally spoke was hushed, reverent. "Maren, whatever comes next, we face it together. But this is bigger than anything we've seen." She nodded, though the tremor beneath the earth reminded her that words were insufficient. Silver flames licked higher along her arms, spiraled around her shoulders, illuminated the crest like a beacon, and yet she did not move forward. She did not flee. She simply stood, eyes scanning the horizon, muscles coiled, senses sharpened, every nerve tuned to the rhythm of the world shifting beneath her. The whisper returned, faint but deliberate, curling through the night like smoke over a frozen river. "She is not the only Luminera, and she is not alone." Maren's breath caught in her throat. Power and destiny swirled within her, tinged with unease and exhilaration. She had always been alone, always hunted, always feared. But now for the first time she sensed a connection that transcended distance, time, and even betrayal. Something or someone shared her essence, her purpose, her Starfire Vein. The implications were staggering, terrifying, exhilarating. The snowstorm around them grew, winds howling as if echoing the voice from the abyss. Trees bent, branches cracking, snow drifting like silver mist. The Shadowrest wolves growled low, forming a protective perimeter, their eyes flicking toward the shadows where movement whispered of secrets yet unseen. And Ravyn, ever vigilant, placed a hand on her arm, grounding, steadying, a silent acknowledgement that they would face this together. Yet even as she felt the warmth of his presence, the certainty of her power and the loyalty of her pack, Maren knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The ground had trembled, the voice had spoken, and destiny had shifted. She was not just the Starfire Vein, she was part of something larger, something older, something alive, and it was waking. Her silver flames pulsed brighter, casting long shadows across the snow and ice, a warning and a declaration in one. She was awake, she was aware, she was unafraid. And the world had yet to see the full force of Maren Silvershade. The whisper faded, leaving only the tremor in the ground, the howl of the wind, the faint glimmer of distant shadows, and the unshakable certainty that what had been set in motion could not be undone. She inhaled, eyes blazing with determination, and whispered to herself, soft but unwavering, "This isn't over, and I am ready." The snow swirled around her like a living curtain, obscuring the horizon, hiding what waited in the shadows, leaving the world suspended in a breathless pause. Every heartbeat, every pulse of her Starfire Vein, every flicker of silver light carried the promise of battles to come, mysteries to unravel, alliances to forge, and enemies to confront. And in that silence, with the moon watching from above and the abyss whispering below, Maren Silvershade stood alone. But not alone. In the storm of destiny, poised on the edge of everything that was about to change forever. The world trembled and the story was only beginning.